Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
I have Dr. Peter Rivera here, and Peter, last year, we collaborated on a Christian Scholar Review blog piece on what it looks like to teach DEI-focused classes as faculty of color and on Christian campuses. I'm curious about your perspectives, both those that were covered in the blog piece, but also things that might have come up since then. Really happy to have you here conversing with me. I guess to start us off, if you could just say what the DEI-focused class is that you teach as MFT faculty, and a little bit of a description of what that class is and whether it's required or optional, who takes the class.
Yeah, for sure. The course that I teach in our marriage and family therapy program is titled Multicultural Topics in Family Therapy. It's structured in our program in such a way that our students get an opportunity to dive deep on topics pertaining to diversity, multicultural topics. For our program, there's a number of courses intended for students to dive deep. So we have a gender course, for instance, and this is one of those special kind of topics courses. Our students, they take this course in their second year of the program. So they've had some time in the program, some exposure to relevant topics before they arrive. I've been teaching it for a handful of years, 5 or 6 years, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from students.
I'm glad to hear of the positive feedback. We'll talk more about that. But is that class required?
It is a required course.
You mentioned the gender class. So does that mean that your class focuses more on race and ethnicity?
Yeah, exactly. It focuses primarily on ethnicity, race, and culture, and topics that intersect with race, ethnicity, and culture. In our program, though, I think it's worth noting that we do attempt to integrate topics related to ethnicity and race and culture in other courses as well as it intersects with the course content. This is just an opportunity for us to dedicate a specific amount of time to those intersections and dive a little bit deeper than students may dive in other classes.
Yeah, I like that point, Peter, that there's a designated class, but also that you're intentional about all of your classes integrating these perspectives. I think both are needed, and only doing one but not the other can fall short of how we serve our students. In the blog piece that you wrote, you mentioned that sometimes you find yourself thinking about the racial comfort of your students and how sometimes that can lead to not going as deep as you would like, for example, on topics related to racism, right? Or not pushing the students in an appropriate way. And I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about that, because that's a real temptation for me as well. And I sometimes succumb to that. What would it look like if you were to succumb to that sort of catering to students versus doing something that you truly believed in?
Yeah, just off the top of my head, I feel like I've evolved over time in how I've managed the comfort and discomfort in the classroom. At the beginning of my career, but also the beginning of teaching of this course, for instance, it would be really easy for me to fall into this like trap of protecting the comfort of students. So what that could look like is that when I sense discomfort, maybe I'm asking a question, maybe I'm seeing a reactive response, for me to just ignore it, or for me to change the topic or change the focus. Over time, I began to realize that, which makes sense. I feel like we all should know this, right? Like that people come into our classroom in different places. There's going to be students who come in with a great deal of like sociocultural awareness, and there's going to be others that have like none at all. And all kinds of different experiences as it pertains to interacting with topics related to diversity. However, this understanding has really pushed me to examine and challenge myself to be able to meet students where they're at. This year was a perfect example where at one point I felt like we were talking about the topic of broaching race in therapeutic relationships. In the classroom discussion that I was facilitating, I felt as though I had 4 or 5 different conversations going on at the same time, in the sense that I could identify these couple of students that I'm connecting with based off of kind of my perceptions on where they're at, need to just wrestle with the idea that, like, yes, even entertaining this topic is going to cause me discomfort, and I need to get through that discomfort. And then we have other students over here that I'm having a conversation with, and this is all part of the same conversation, which makes it pretty wild sometimes, but they've already gotten to that place. They're willing to broach the topic, but now they want more. Okay, so what? I'm willing to go there. I need to develop a sense, understanding of why I need to go there. But having these multiple conversations at the same time as part of all one single conversation wasn't something that I was able to do in the past. But I think part of it also has been that just my understanding of students' kind of multicultural development has grown. So I'm able to almost speculate, but almost not speculating, because in our course, the very first thing students do before the quarter even starts is take a handful of assessments on their multicultural competencies and awarenesses. And that allows me to get a feel for where people are at. But even beyond the assessments, though, just based off of my conversations, based off of the assignments and the things that they're producing in their assignments, I feel like I start to get a good feel for where they're at. But I didn't have that when I first started. So it was easy for me to just be reactive as opposed to calculated in my conversations. This year, especially, I spent some time reflecting on some conversations I was having with my class, where I felt like, yes, I'm almost tailoring my responses and questions where students are at in hopes to guide them and push them forward in their own development. I found myself reflecting on that and being like, man, I actually really enjoy it. However, I also think that there can be times where students sense it as chaotic. But at the same time, I think it's good for them too, because when you have students reacting, for instance, a group of students that, let's say that they're extremely fragile as it pertains to engaging with topics related to diversity, equity, or inclusion. Other students sense that, especially the ones that are further along in their development, which kind of adds to the perception that this is chaotic or maybe this is uncomfortable. Or that process of being able to sit in that space, I think is good for their development.
Yeah, good chaos, right? Educational chaos, especially for folks who are in training to become therapists and to be able to navigate complicated conversations. I really appreciated what you said, Peter, because when I teach on these topics, I was told, just do your thing. And then if people push back, double down on it, right? Like just do your thing and stay the course. That's the advice that I've gotten. But you're saying that through experience, you're able to maybe find meaningful connecting points for students at varying levels of development, which is really, I think, sophisticated.
But you know what the problem is with that advice too, just staying in your course, at least for me. First off, I have this burning social justice spirit in me, right? So when I hear something that lands extremely off, right? Just staying the course for me sends a message to my students that when they see something or hear something that is inappropriate, that is not sensitive, that silence is an option. But we know that silence sends a message too, right? That maybe what you said is okay.
And the approach that you're describing, Peter, where you're sensitive to all of your students and where they are, requires you to have that kind of a close mentoring relationship with students, that to be able to tailor your teaching to those levels, you have to know your students, right? You can't just have a one size fits all approach. So I think that's another thing that you're highlighting there.
Let me throw this out there too, Paul. Once you begin to develop an understanding too of a student's development across your course, and even the interactions with the different kind of assessments or assignments, you begin to develop an understanding of what to expect as well, right? So for instance, one thing that we do on the very first day of this course is come up with ground rules, right? What are some ground rules to guide our conversation so that everybody feels safe and everybody feels okay with having conversations? Most often, you get a lot of students engaging on the topic, but you get a lot of students who are part of marginalized communities who, for whatever reason, don't speak up. And as an instructor, typically that would be a thing that I'd be intentional with inviting in their voices. However, based off of just my experiences, I know that there's going to be a group of students that reach out to me and say, I was very uncomfortable with how we set our ground rules. These are the students that have progressed a little bit in their awareness, right? But they haven't figured out how to do something with that awareness. But then you also get sometimes the students who are part of those marginalized communities who also reach out. But that intentionally then sets the table for me to have those conversations around, yes, but why didn't you say something? For me, at least, begins to like get them to a place where they begin to realize it's not just about learning content, right? It's about engaging in ways that reflect this awareness, right? So for those students who are part of the majority culture, for instance, that have a problem, but it's not just about picking up and sensing that this is kind of off. There's people's voices that need to be represented. Maybe there's a lot of fragility in forming some of the rules. It's not just about awareness, but it's actually about action too. But it's a great opportunity though to have that, right? Because it's like, I'm not just talking about it. You just experienced it. And now you're being challenged to actually do something moving forward. And that's something that I think is awesome. And that comes with being able to teach a course over and over, where you then become a little bit more familiar to the flow and what to expect. And I think that's a beautiful thing. That's one thing that I love about this course and other courses, I guess, that I've taught, is that awareness of how can I intentionally engage the flow of things, and with that understanding of I have an idea of what's going to happen or what, and how can I use that to help students in their development.
Yeah, you have enough data from teaching that you could make reasonable predictions about how students will respond. For me, I do a similar thing with the ground rules, where I have students talk about what they think are important rules. And similarly, it's usually students coming up with things like, oh, be respectful of each other and assume best intent, all these things about being nice. And I think I want to do a better job of also pointing out that sometimes these conversations are really difficult and there are some uncomfortable moments. And how do we take action steps to cope with those moments as well?
At the beginning of the course, we use the intercultural development inventory. But those students that come to me after this exercise and setting the ground rules always fall into a particular profile. So they fall into the adaptation profile, which is like, oh, you have an understanding of commonalities, of differences. In essence, you have an increased awareness. But the challenge is for these people, what the heck do I do with it? That's what we're getting at, in essence, through that experience of setting the ground rules, not saying anything, and then coming to me and being like, what just happened? But it's a great opportunity for us too, once we go over the intercultural development inventory, to say, this is where you're at, but they can look back on that experience and say, oh, okay, so that kind of resonates, right? Like those connections.
Yeah, I like how you're using both quantitative data, but also qualitative, in the sense that you're connecting the data to the student interactions. That's really cool. So this bringing of the whole self into teaching, I think we both in our pieces talked about how sometimes the materials that we teach become so personal to us, right? Or lots of times. And the way that students respond to us sometimes really highlight the fact that these are personal topics. Like, for example, I've gotten comments on my course feedback that I seem to have a personal agenda, or that I'm not really teaching research, I'm teaching about personal experiences. I'm curious if you've gotten similar sentiments, or maybe different types of what I would call microaggressions from students that you have maybe wrestled with, or you found ways to effectively cope with.
Yeah. You know, I think, well, first off, just to be clear that across all the courses I teach, outside of this course, this multicultural course, I definitely feel like I can bring my whole self to the table. However, as an ethnic racial minority, when talking about topics of ethnicity and race, for instance, teaching about racism, yes, I've experienced racism in my life, right? And make those like connections. I can draw from personal examples, but that's in part modeling that's intentional, because for our students, it's important for them to be able to make connections between course content and lived experience. However, you're right in that there has been experiences, which I think I wrote about a little bit about in my blog post, where students who aren't there yet, who are at a particular place in their development, can be very reactive to certain kind of experiences that I offer to supplement whatever we're talking about. The experience that stands out to me is kind of, well, it takes the form of micro invalidation, right? Nobody's going to attack me or insult me because I'm a professor, I'm the teacher in the room, and there's that power difference. However, invalidating is maybe a little bit easier to do when there's kind of a power imbalance. And for me, I had an experience once where I was teaching about racism, we're talking about racism, and I asked some students to offer some examples. Students were offering examples. I offered an example. In my offering, there was a student respond and try to invalidate the experience. And it was really interesting because I was reactive, right? Inside. I mean, I was able to manage it, but inside I was like, man, like, that's where you're at. That's not where I want you to be. But for me, in that particular situation, which happened pretty early on in my career, I was able to keep it together, but I had to redirect a little bit in the sense. But before I redirected, I didn't necessarily leave it. So I remember just saying, part of this course is going to make you uncomfortable. And we're also going to touch on content around how do you engage in conversations about ethnicity and race, where your client is going to feel validated and not invalidated. So not overtly saying, you just invalidated like my experience, that was a microaggression, like, how dare you, but more so like offering an invitation for the student to reflect on, oh, what just happened, but also some reassurance that where they were at, I wasn't going to just leave them there.
Right. Yeah. That's really good. You're connecting it to your learning outcomes, right? But at the same time, making a point that you will not stay silent in the face of that invalidation and modeling that for other students who are watching. That's really good. I'm taking mental notes here, Peter. For me, I feel like when I feel invalidated or maybe even insulted in the classroom, I have trouble redirecting like you did. So I'm learning to do that more, but I just take it so personally that I freeze and then move on to the next thing. And then I stew about it afterwards.
I stewed for sure.
Yeah. But I think in that moment, though, you found a way to make it a very constructive moment for the students, which I appreciate that example. Yeah. I wanted to also ask about this setting that we're in. We're in a Christian institution or a faith-based learning institution where this integration of Christian faith is super important. We all do it different ways. And especially, I think, between graduate school classes and undergrad classes, I imagine there might be some differences there as well. But I'm excited to hear from you about this because I know that this is an area that you've thought a lot about. How do you do this, especially in an era where Christianity is viewed as antithetical to DEI topics?
Yeah. I'm happy you brought that up, Paul, because I think that context matters, right? So my students, probably half, but it can vary, I guess, but I would say maybe half, a little bit over half, do share my faith, and then half, a little less than half, don't share my faith. So there definitely has to be like a sensitivity to that.
Yeah.
However, when you want to talk about topics of ethnicity, race, culture, and like Christianity, those are topics that get me passionate. Those are topics that inside of me, I can sense that passion. So for me to not be able to engage it would be crazy. The opportunity to engage is an enticing kind of invitation that I would never be able to say no to. I see that in my classroom, though, because half of the students in my room do share my faith. Some of our students, we have a dual degree track where you can pursue a master's in marriage and family therapy and then pursue some education in the seminary. And so I know that there's also ministers that are present in my classroom, right? So for me, ignoring the fact that these students exist in my classroom and missing the opportunity to engage them on topics of ethnicity, race, and culture and Christianity
Right.
would be insane for me. It wouldn't make any sense, especially because I know that a lot of them, and this is a huge generalization. However, I think there's some evidence to help support it. But I know a lot of them are not getting it in their church communities. They're not getting discipled on topics of ethnicity, race, and culture. Those are topics, and just like what we were talking about earlier, those are topics where pastors, something happens out in society, right, that brings ethnicity, race, and culture to the forefront of everybody's minds.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, I'm concerned about the comfort. I'm concerned about my comfort. I'm just going to ignore this topic. So with that said, some of my students who have come up to me, I've only had a handful of students actually, like afterwards, after the courses ended, or maybe even after they graduated, reach out to me to be like, man, like that course was like so impactful. Most of the students I have are the ones that share my faith, right? But those are the ones also that have really had a hard time. Like it was not comfortable. It was not easy for them to engage some of the topics that we talked about. But for me, going back to your question, it's so essential for me to be able to underscore the importance of diversity, starting from the very beginning, and drilling home the idea, the foundational idea for my students that right from the beginning, right in scripture, in Genesis, all the way to the end in Revelation, we have diversity. We can see God's intentionality. So like diversity is not just a byproduct of something, right? It was part of God's design. But also, what does that mean for us? We talk about social justice, for instance, too. And what does that mean for a theology that's connected to justice, right? For those who believe in a God of justice, a righteous and justice God. There's all kinds of different topics that we can hit on. Sometimes it can be just pointing students in the direction, right? Being able to say, oh, when we're talking about social justice, for those who share my faith, make sure that you're reading scripture, make sure that you're taking a look at Amos and reading that book. Like that's all about social justice. So some of it is like straight up just education and trying to expose students to scripture, to theology that connects to diversity, that connects to ethnicity and race and their understandings of it and the implications of that understanding. Now, I did say that I have to be sensitive to students that don't share my faith in the room. However, the way that I conceptualize this is that I'm speaking to those who share my faith, but for those who don't, I'm exposing them a little bit to my faith. And also, as therapists, being able to create space for others to engage in things that are different than things that we've engaged in. That's a skill, right? That's something that needs to be cultivated. So for those who don't share my faith, being able to hear me speak to other students and engage in conversations pertaining to our faith. Yeah. Engage in those topics and being able to not be reactive, being able to be comfortable, being able to be curious, being able to be open. That's an educational process in itself, right? That's something that's helping cultivate skills that they need as therapists.
That's great. I sense that boldness on your part to talk about your faith and how you connect that to even your non-Christian students, learning from that experience about, like you said, listening and engaging other cultures, other faiths.
I was working at Penn State before SPU, and that piece definitely stood out to me where I was like, man, I don't have space to fully overtly engage my faith in what I am doing. Not that I couldn't do it, because I'd look to engage my faith in everything that I'm doing. And we're part of a Christian institution. So how would we not take advantage of being able to overtly integrate our faith into the education that we provide our students?
That's powerful, Peter. Not all colleagues of ours think similarly to what you said, right? That, like I've heard colleagues say, for example, oh, in our graduate program, students come to SPU despite the fact that it's a Christian school versus because it's a Christian school, which I understand might be the reality. But then they say that means that we are really careful to not be so overt in our faith integration, right? Because of the fact that graduate students are not looking for, on average, a faith integration process. So I think you're giving me a contrasting picture to that type of an approach. Have you heard those sentiments among colleagues who teach in the graduate programs?
I've heard them before. Where my mind goes is that God brought these students to me for a reason. And if I was to not ever expose them to my faith, that just would be crazy. That's just wrapped up in like how I understand my ministry.
That's really powerful. On the first day of class, I do a survey, and one of the survey questions asks students, how important is faith integration in this class? When I first started at SPU, most people checked extremely important or moderately important, right? So it was skewed toward those responses. Over the years, most students are now checking not at all important or moderately unimportant or something like that, toward the other end of the Likert scale. That doesn't mean that I don't do faith integration, but I sense that maybe students have a certain perspective when they come into my classroom about how faith fits into the DEI topic. So part of my excitement in teaching this at a Christian institution is what you describe, which is connecting Christian faith to cross-cultural psychology, that we study cross-cultural because of our faith convictions.
Based off of what you just said in your survey and the results that you've seen, I would argue that if you haven't received like solid training, if you haven't been discipled on these topics, then how would you know how important it is to be represented in this course content? So there would be a degree of bias in those results in my mind. What we're saying is really something that I should be paying attention to and sensitive to, like moving forward.
Students might be coming into my classroom thinking that what society says about Christianity and how they engage culture is 100% true. So if that's their mentality, then of course in a survey, they might say, oh, I don't want to approach things from a Christian perspective. They might be equating Christianity with anti-DEI, right?
And even for the Christians, you may have Christians saying that too, but it's, I believe that because I'm a product of the large church that actually avoids these topics, so I don't see them as relevant. And we're all made the same, all our identities are shed away, and so therefore the color of your skin doesn't matter. And so I could see even that angle as well for those who have been ill-equipped.
On that last point that you made about racial colorblindness, I find that, and research actually shows this too, that in religious contexts, there's sometimes this faith-based racial colorblindness that's perpetuated. And so I'm curious in your experience, and I'm not just talking about with students, but like institutionally or culturally, if you've seen examples of that or corollaries of that, where this mentality of we're all God's children, therefore we shouldn't be really talking about race. Have you seen any manifestations of that kind of a mentality?
I mean, we see it institutionally, right? In the avoidance of the topic, and avoidance of strategies to maintain ethnic, racial minority faculty members. So for me, institutionally, like comes with the decisions that are being made from those who have power, like at the institution, and potentially reflects kind of where they're at, right? And their development and their awareness and their understanding. With our students, in our interview process, we ask a question, are there any groups that you would not ever want to work with? And sometimes, actually, that's very rare, but there has been a few times where people have mentioned specific ethnic racial groups. That question intentionally for us is meant to shed light on our understanding of, can we get you to where you need to be at graduation for us to be comfortable and confident that we're sending out a solid therapist that's going to do great work. So again, off topic a little bit, but yeah, it is a thing, color blindness, especially within the Christian circle too. But for me, that's just, again, another indicator that Christianity in general really has struggled, especially Western Christianity has struggled to disciple believers on these topics, ways that allow them to fully step into who God created them to be.
And sometimes the colorblindness also is connected to this mentality of let's celebrate diversity, but let's not talk about the hard stuff that is also part of diversity. If you want to talk about like the good part of having a diverse campus, like our faculty numbers or student numbers, we'll do that. But if we're going to talk about the inequities impacting our faculty of color or our students of color, then that might be more hesitation regarding that conversation. So I sense that in a place like SPU or a Christian community where there's more of a readiness to talk about the celebration and then less willingness to lament and to talk about the challenging parts.
And that lamenting piece is like huge. You know what's interesting too, though? I could be wrong. And maybe this is the case at all higher ed like institutions, but I feel like when you look at the history at SPU, as it pertains to conversations that they've been having related to ethnicity and race and culture and diversity, they've been having the same conversations like over and over and over across time. But there has to be a point in which leadership eventually gets to a place where they say, no, like enough with having the same conversation and let's actually do something. Let's take action so that we don't even have to have this conversation moving forward.
That's right. Sometimes it feels like not only are we having the same conversations, but sometimes we are taking a step back, right? Yeah, but I mean, we could go on about that. I have a couple of questions that I ask all people that I talk to. What advice might you have for faculty who are just starting out in Christian higher education?
One thing that I would throw out there is don't be surprised or be prepared for not everybody, not all of your colleagues, not all of the faculty at the institution to be in with your understanding of ethnicity, race, culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, and the intersections with Christianity, with our faith. One of the very first things that I was exposed to coming in as a junior faculty member at SPU was a faculty-wide email. My contract hadn't even started. We're like a couple months out, right? And just moved to Seattle. And the very first email I get is somebody going off how social justice shouldn't be taught at a Christian institution. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? Right. I remember reaching out to our department chair at that time and being like, is this a commonly held view? Because if it is, I need to know, because I need to figure out what the heck my plans are moving forward, because I really need to question whether this is where I need to be. And that was a startling moment. I remember being rocked. The department chair at the time did a great job at kind of calming me down and assuring me that no, that wasn't everybody's commonly held belief. But in that moment, I was just like, man, whoever sent that email shares my faith. How can you share my faith and think that we shouldn't, as Christian faculty members, be talking about social justice? So definitely one of my pieces of advice would be, don't come in expecting everything to align with your beliefs as it pertains to topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I would encourage someone coming in to really think about how much they're going to invest, because the chances that there are a great number of opportunities for the institution to grow on topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you can easily get sucked into that, right? Get overinvested. People may ask a lot of you when it pertains to coming in and needing to be that person that helps be the expert. But coming in knowing that maybe I'm willing to invest, but to what degree? Maybe I'm going to be intentional with where I invest. Maybe I'm going to give it some time and not invest and get a feel for where I really want to plug in, put my efforts in. I think is probably some good advice as well. And I think, I want to say being intentional too with creating a network of support among your colleagues, maybe other ethnic, racial, minority faculty members at the same institution or seeing similar things, maybe having similar experiences. I would imagine that would be extremely important as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that, yes, important to be aware that not all people part of your Christian community will share similar views about DEI, but then to find people who do share similar beliefs and that you could connect with and provide support to and receive support from, I think that's really important too. So thank you for speaking into that. Peter, I really appreciate our conversation.
I appreciate it. I really enjoyed this. Anytime you want to talk about, anytime I get a chance to talk about topics related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm all for it. So yeah, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to be able to talk about some of these things.
It was my pleasure. I feel like I learned a lot from you. So thanks, Peter.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.